Okay, so picture this. Over 4 years, more than 70 million people put on a military uniform. Four of the world's biggest empires would literally crumble into dust, the entire map of the world completely redrawn. This is the story of World War I, a conflict so huge, so unbelievably devastating, they just called it the Great War. But how in the world did it even start? It sounds kind of crazy, doesn't it? The idea that a single bullet fired in a city most people had never heard of could ignite a global firestorm that would kill millions. But it did. The real question is why? How was the world so ready to just explode? Well, that's the puzzle we're going to piece together right now. All right, first things first, we have to get one thing straight. The assassination wasn't really the cause of the war, it was just the trigger. The real reasons had been building up for decades. You see, Europe in 1914 was basically a giant powder keg, just sitting there, primed and ready for conflict, waiting for a single spark to set the whole thing off. To make sense of it all, a simple little acronym really helps. MAIN. The M stands for militarism. And this was, well, a massive arms race. Britain and the newly powerful Germany were in this huge competition to build bigger and better navies. On land, armies were drawing up these incredibly detailed war plans, like Germany's famous Schlieffen Plan. These weren't just suggestions, they were like rigid, unstoppable timetables for invasion. The whole idea was, hey, if war is going to happen anyway, we have to strike first and we have to strike fast. The A is for alliances. Now, this is where it gets messy. Europe was tangled up in this crazy web of treaties, almost like a continental tripwire system. If one country got attacked, its allies were legally required to jump into the fight. This whole system was supposed to keep the peace, create a balance of power. But what it really created was a doomsday machine that guaranteed any small local conflict would instantly become a massive, continent-wide war. Next up, I is for imperialism. The great powers were all scrambling for colonies over in Africa and Asia, fighting over resources and really just global bragging rights. Germany was kind of the new kid on the block, and it felt like it deserved its own place in the sun, which, of course, directly challenged the old-school empires of Britain and France. This global rivalry just added a ton of fuel to an already raging fire. And finally, the N is for nationalism. This was the emotional charge in the air, this intense, sometimes dangerous national pride. So in France, you had this burning desire to get revenge on Germany for a war back in 1871 and to reclaim lost land. Over in the Balkans, you had Slavic peoples who desperately wanted to break free from the Austro-Hungarian Empire. This kind of supercharged patriotism made compromise pretty much impossible. So with all these alliances locked in place, the continent was officially split right down the middle. On one side, you had the Triple Alliance. That's Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. And on the other, you had the Triple Entente, which linked France, Russia, and Britain. Europe had become two massive, armed camps, just staring each other down, waiting for someone to blink. And with the stage set so perfectly, all it needed was that one spark. The assassination of an archduke gave them just that. And the complex, terrifying machinery of war began to turn with a speed that shocked everyone. Now look at this timeline. The speed of the collapse is just mind-blowing. On June 28th, the Archduke is shot. Boom. Exactly 1 month later, Austria-Hungary declares war on Serbia. Russia, who sees itself as the big protector of the Serbs, starts mobilizing its massive army. 2 days after that, Germany declares war on Russia. Then, Germany declares war on France. And when Germany invades neutral Belgium to get to France, Britain has no choice but to declare war. It was a chain reaction. In just 5 weeks, all the dominoes had fallen, and Europe was at war. Millions of young men marched off to war in the summer of 1914, just buzzing with patriotic excitement. They thought it would be a glorious adventure. But that dream quickly turned into a new kind of industrial, muddy nightmare. The belief on all sides was that this thing would be over in a few weeks. The boys will be home by Christmas, they all said. They'd be heroes who taught the other guys a quick lesson. Man, was that optimism tragically, catastrophically wrong. Instead of a quick victory, they got this. The brutal reality of the Western Front. And it was captured perfectly by the soldier-poet Wilfred Owen. It became a war of trenches, mud, rats, barbed wire, and endless artillery. It wasn't a war where men were heroes charging gallantly into battle. It was a war where men were just fed into the meat grinder of industrialized slaughter. The whole strategy became something called attrition, which is a cold way of saying you're just trying to kill more of their guys than they can kill of your guys. And the human cost, as you can see here, was just staggering. The Battle of Verdun had 700,000 casualties for basically no change in the front line. And at the Somme, it was over 1 million. These weren't battles in the old sense. They were month-long industrial-scale slaughters. And the technology of death just kept evolving. Poison gas brought a whole new level of psychological terror to the battlefield. The tank was literally invented to try and break the stalemate of the trenches. And up in the sky, airplanes, which were a super recent invention, went from being simple spotters to deadly fighting machines. Every single one of these innovations was meant to end the war, but in reality, most of them just made it more horrific. For years, the war was just this bloody, grinding stalemate. But in 1917, two massive global events happened almost at the same time that will completely change the direction of the war and ultimately seal Germany's fate. So on one hand, Russia completely collapsed into revolution and pulled out of the war. That was a huge win for Germany. But at almost the exact same moment, Germany's policy of using its U-boats to sink any ship in the Atlantic, including American ones, finally dragged the United States into the fight. So, just as the Allies lost one major partner, they gained a brand new and much, much more powerful one. And the impact of America entering the war? It really comes down to this one single, staggering number: 2 million. That's how many fresh, well-fed, well-equipped American soldiers started pouring into Europe by 1918. For the completely exhausted French and British armies, and against a German army that was stretched to its absolute breaking point, this was the game changer. The stalemate wasn't just broken, it was shattered. But the end of the fighting was far from the end of the story. The peace that came after the war was deeply flawed, and in its attempt to solve old problems, it actually created a whole host of new ones that would haunt the world for decades to come. At the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, the armistice was finally signed. After 4 long years of unimaginable carnage, there was silence. The war was over. But now the winners had to figure out how to build a new world from the smoking ruins of the old one. And this is what they came up with, the Treaty of Versailles. And let me tell you, it was a harsh, bitter peace. Germany lost huge chunks of its territory. Its military was practically dismantled. They were forced to pay what we call reparations, basically a massive bill for all the war damages. But maybe the most damaging part of all was Article 231, the infamous War Guilt Clause, which forced Germany to accept 100% of the blame for starting the war. You can imagine this created a deep, lasting bitterness inside Germany. The consequences were just immense. 4 ancient empires, gone, vanished from the map. New and often very unstable countries were carved out of their territory. The United States officially became the world's financial superpower, and the new borders that were drawn, especially in the Middle East, created tensions and conflicts that are literally still playing out today. The war didn't just change the world, it completely remade it. And that brings us to the ultimate tragic irony of the whole thing. The generation that fought and survived this catastrophe desperately called it the war to end all wars. But the bitter peace, the economic chaos, the unresolved hatreds it left behind, it did the exact opposite. Every punitive clause in that treaty, every new border drawn in anger, became a seed for the future. They didn't end war. They planted the dragon's teeth of World War II. The end of this great tragedy was really just the prologue to an even greater one.